Hi, this is part 2 of my scroll project where I create this last panel with the robin and add extra touches in different parts of the piece. I get into lots of detail on the blanket stitch, creating it and embellishing it, brainstorm ideas for the background of a scene, and I show a new way to fill in the background of the bird to make your stitching easier. Let's get started. So I thought what might be fun to do in this area that's in between these two birds is to do a little bit more blanket stitch. Very similar to what I did here. Now when I made this, I started with my blanket stitching around the bird, and then I moved out around and around and around. So it started in the center. What I'm thinking about doing, and it's the same technique, it's just where you start and continue, is to make a line about here and then have the blanket stitching go to about here. Just a little area in here. And that would cover both these little top areas. That might add a little bit of visual interest here and maybe even give me some more ideas about where to go from there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch a straight line. And that straight line is going to be the jumping off point to continue my stitching. So instead of, for example, I could surround this bird, I could do blanket stitch all around and then continue and continue like I did at the other end. Here, I'm going to make a line and then I'm going to move in one direction instead of two. I'm starting here, I've secured my knot at the back and I'm going to go all the way to the edge with this. And then I'm going to move up. So this isn't blanket stitch yet. This is just a line I'm creating. And I'm doing the back stitch. I'm taking a stitch. I'm going past it and coming out and going back towards it. Then I'm coming out where this one started, taking a stitch, and coming back out here. Now, this isn't a straight line. I could have drawn a line with my erasable pen if I wanted it to be really, really straight. But I want this line to be a little bit more organic. Kind of like if it's a tiny bit wonky, adds a bit of visual interest and it makes it a little less of a stark line. So these stitches that exist here, just ignoring them. I'm not trying to interfere with them or connect with them or be related to them. I'm just ignoring it at this point. I'm going to go to the edge with this as well. I think what I'll do is come from the back, take a tiny little stitch through the very top there. So there's my line, and I'm going to come up at the edge here. Now I'm going to start my blanket stitch. So I'm keeping my working thread to the side, and I'm using this hand to kind of pull it out of the way. So what's happening is I'm creating an area for my needle to come in and form a loop. So I'm going to come up. And so now my needle is coming up inside of that thread. And I'm going to just keep doing that, coming up from the bottom to the top. This is just one way of doing this. And I'm holding that thread in my left hand. You can also do this the other orientation. Just do whatever is comfortable for you. In terms of the spacing, I'm just doing it by eye. You could also make marks. And each time my needle's coming up and it's getting pulled into that loop. Now at this point, depending on what you're doing, I could turn and work this way again, and I could make more blanket stitches and I could continue the line this way. I could tie off my thread and start again. If going in one direction is more comfortable and enjoyable, I could come back up. I'll show you how you would do that. So this is the last loop and I want it to be pulled up so that it matches the other ones. So I'm going to take one stitch down to secure that. So now that's held there. Then I could just knot off here. I'm going to move my thread a little inwards so I don't have a knot sticking off the edge. Then I can go back and start here. You see that first stitch I took has that little shape there. So what you can do is you could come up and then you can hook your needle underneath there. Now everything's matching, and I can either try and make parallel lines or I can go in between each stitch. So I could start here with this one and it would make a tiny little box here. I can skip to the next one, come up and make the same stitches as before and do it exactly the same way. The first one's going to have that little triangular shape instead of the square shape, which I can leave, or I can come back again and pull it up like I did with that first stitch. So I'm going in between, under this thread from before. I'm going under, I'm coming up and making a loop. So that's making offset stitches, which is a nice effect. So I'm at the end here, and also my thread is coming to the end. You don't want to do this stitch with really short ends of your thread because most likely it's going to come off the needle. So now I can end this here and go down, or I could take one more stitch from the corner here. If I want this to go, see there, it did come off my needle. If I want this to go to the end. So you can see I kind of varied the size there. So you can be really precise about it, or you can be imprecise about it. And either way, it looks really good. So I'm just rethreading this onto the needle because it came off. And then I'm going to take it to the back and make my knot. So there's 2 rows of this white, and I'm going to continue with this wonky blanket stitch, and I'm going to move it over in as far as I think it looks good. I'm not sure how far I'll go. I won't know till I'm doing it, but I'm going to move it towards the heron here. So I've come back on the other side, adding a row. This is my initial row that I stitched. I've added a couple of rows in this direction, and I decided to come and add 1 row here, and I'm angling this row. You can see that I've gotten skinnier as I went along, and that's going to make this line a little bit straighter as I was going. This is starting to get diagonal, which is fine. I thought it would be nice visually to add 1 row here that is also angled. So here's that row. And now I'm going to come back and add a row here. So my options are to continue and try and make sort of a uniform size. So this is going to make this line continue to sort of become an angled line, or I could make larger squares here and sort of taper them down, and that would even this out. So there's lots of options in terms of size and adjusting the shape as you're doing this. And that's something that I did quite a bit as I was going around in a circle. This is a little more complex because there's so many bumps here. So as I came into a valley, I had to adjust the size of my stitches, the width of my stitches. And then as I came around the hill here, I actually sometimes would add an extra stitch. If you do crochet, you'll understand what I mean here about adding stitches and how, because this is getting bigger, you're going to need more stitches as you go out. So this is something you just do by eye as you move along. And it's actually a really nice meditative process to go around and around, as well as going back and forth and back and forth. So I'm going to continue and make this a little bit wider. Now that I'm finished on this side, I'm hopping over here. So here I'm at the end. I could, of course, keep going. I think right now I'm going to stop. I've just come to the edge of this, and I've come into the beginning of this yellow part. And so this is a good example of how when you're working, one thing informs the next thing. And so I'm looking at this really interesting design that's been made with this white, and I'm looking in this direction back at my chicken and my bunny, and I can see that what might be nice is to add some of this white into the background where the chicken is. There's white here with these clouds, and this blue, sort of turquoise blue stitching that goes from here all the way across to here sort of unites this area. And I've broken it up by doing different types of stitching. And if you can see this pale blue color, I've brought all behind where the bunny is, and that's made that background a different design and look to this. And yet those stitches are running through. So the idea I'm having now is about adding some white here, which will tie this part to this part, and also it will tie into the white and the heavy stitching. So that's my next idea I'm going to work on. I still plan on doing more in this direction, but when an idea comes, one of the things about intuitive stitching is to go with an idea when you have it and to move forward with that idea. And so I'm going to tie off here my very last stitch with this blanket stitch and hop over here and stitch in the background. So I've started taking some small stitches in white. I'm going in relatively vertically, and I'm making the stitches small. So in scale, they're smaller than this, and they're also smaller than these turquoise blue stitches that exist. So similar in a way to these tiny little stitches I took in this paler blue color behind the bunny. So already I can see that that's blending these two areas really well. So I'm just going to keep, and what I'm doing is just hopping around in spots where there aren't stitches. I'm adding the tiniest of marks. Where the space is a little bit bigger, I can add a little bit of a bigger stitch, and where it's smaller, I can add a smaller stitch. And this is going to have a cumulative visual effect. And of course, I can come back and add more if I move across the piece here and I decide that I like the effect, but I want it to be even heavier, even more white, then I can do that. You can see here with the bunny, I did that. I went across back and forth a couple of times, adding more and more and more. And so I have that option here. I'm going to start with this sort of general spacing that I'm doing now. Not measuring anything, I'm just doing my wandering stitch and keeping the stitches vertical, but not all straight. And then once I've moved across to probably right here, then I can look at it and evaluate and see if I want to go back and add more. So I've moved across to here, and I'm liking those little tiny flecks of white. And I added some in this orange spot too. And so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it all the way across to here. This blue starts here. So I'll move the white to here, and I'll move it down here, and I'll go back and add some more. So I like what that's added. I think now I'm going to leave it at this level of the white, and I can always come back later and add more. So I walked away and came back and decided I wanted to add some white down in the bottom area too, to match the white in the top. And that differentiates this little area from this area. I think I still want to add a little bit down here in a darker color to ground this bird a little bit. But for now, I'm going to move on. And what I've done is I've taken one strand each of the darker green and the lighter green, the same colors that I'd used here. So it's these two colors. And I'm going to do some stitches a little different than these, which kind of are hinting at grass or reeds. I'm going to do some slow stitching, and I'm going to do it vertically. I'm going to see what I think of that. So I'm going to actually start over here, right beside where I had done this white blanket stitching. I'm not coming down here yet because I'm not sure if I want it in the lower area, but I know I want it in the upper area. So I'm going to come up here, and then I'm going to move across. So there's already stitching here in this turquoise blue color. So this is going to add another color dimension and more texture to this one area. And it's going to look quite different, I think, here, just because there's less stitching. So once all that stitching is completed here, I can look at it and decide what my next move will be in terms of stitching and how noticeable or interesting or how I feel about how this is looking. I haven't decided at this point if I want the stitching to come up into this area with the yellow. So I'm also going to leave that for now because I can always come back and add more stitching later. I don't generally take out stitches when I'm working this way. If there's some stitching that I've done that I am looking at and I'm not happy with the way it's looking, usually what that means is I need to add something instead of ripping out the stitches, unless there's something that's really jarring to me. I just leave the stitches in. It's very, very rare that I will come back in and remove stitching that I've already done. So for this first pass, I'm taking fairly large stitches and I'm spacing them out maybe more than the amount that I want them to be in the end, because I know I can always come back and add more. And you may notice at this point, I'm starting to notice that maybe they're slanting a little bit. The stitches aren't the same size. That's all part of this process, and it's totally fine. In the end, it's going to look good, and while it may be noticeable that the stitches are different sizes, I don't think it's going to look wrong or like a mistake. It's just part of this type of stitching. Some people prefer to have stitches that are fairly uniform, and for their eye, that's their preference. And so, you know, in this process, the main thing to do is to do what you like and what makes you happy. So there's nothing wrong with feeling like you want those stitches to be really straight. So just do what feels right to you, and don't worry about what someone else might have an opinion about, because this is your creation and it's your expression of your style. And one thing I know about myself and my style in sewing is that wonky or frayed or not uniform works for me. And worrying about perfection takes the joy out of it for me. So I don't worry about it. So you might notice that sometimes I'm doing these stab stitches where I'm going from the front all the way to the back and coming in, and other times I'm doing this running stitch. So I do whatever stitch feels comfortable in my hand and makes sense for the angle that I'm holding everything on and the size and that kind of thing. So the overall effect, you can't tell which way that I stitched because the stitches look the same. And so it's really just about what works for you. So it seems to be in this situation, when I'm moving from left to right, my hand wants to do the stab stitch. And when I'm moving from right to left, my hand wants to stack up some stitches like this. Okay, now I'm just going to come up from the bottom here and finish this little area. So I like the effect that these two colored strands are giving, and I want to add more stitching here. So now is a time to look at it and think about, do I want the same thread, one of each? Do I want a completely different color, or do I want just one of the colors? And so this is just a choice that's totally open to interpretation. So I'm going to step away from looking at this for a moment, and I'll come back to it. And I think when I do that, I will know what I want to do next. So I'm nodding off here. And then I'm going to move on to something else. Something else I was thinking about, I mentioned, is adding some stitches under this chicken here. So I've done this very dark stitching under my bunny, and right beside it is the chicken. So I could add more. This is actually navy blue here. I'm sure it reads as black, and this at the bottom is black. So I could come in with either of those colors here, and that would be nice, especially since these clouds are quite prominent. The other thing I could do is take the color that I used to outline the chicken, which is a darker brown. Let me grab it here. So this is the color in one strand that I've got. I went around the chicken after I had stitched it to outline it. So I could put this color down, or the navy blue or the black down. So that's going to be different than this. So if I want to differentiate them, this would be a good color for that. It is blending more with the colors in the chicken, and maybe it is a transition into another area. Or because I have this line here of the blanket stitch, which is a real transition point to the next area, I could come in with the dark color. This one happens to be the black, and put that down. That's one strand. This is two strands. That might be nice. So I've got these black lines here and this piece of silk. Yeah, I think I like that. I can grab my navy blue and see what that looks like. So here's the navy blue. It's This is all 6 strands, so that's not going to tell me. Separate out a strand here and look at it, and that's not a lot different than the black. I could use either and it's kind of the same effect. So I'm going to use, well, since I already have this small strand of black, I'm going to use this black and I'm going to add some stitching under here. So I've added some lines in the black, and I'm going to come back in with 1 strand each of the light and dark green, same colors I've used here, and I'm going to add a little bit of marks that are going to hint at foliage and greenery. I'm going to make the same kind of marks that are already here, straight lines in different orientations. This is going to add to the color and texture here, and it's also going to add some grounding, just like the black lines did. And this also, because it's the same color that I'm using beside it, it's going to tie things together in a very subtle way. You can see already that's adding a little something, and I'm just going to keep going. After a few stitches moving across the piece, I'm going to stop and look at it, see if I think it needs more, and just keep going that way. These green stitches are going to show up quite a bit in the areas down at the bottom here where there's this strip of fabric that has a off-white and a red, because green is the opposite of red. So that means when they're placed next to each other, they're really going to pop. So I'm just looking at it now and evaluating how it looks. And I think it's looking good. So I took this color, these 2 strands of light and dark green, and I brought them across the bottom here. And I went all the way over to where I already had these 2 colors separated. So it kind of met up. This 2-tone color meets the 1-tone color. So that's nice to have a tiny little hint of a continuity along the bottom. I didn't bring it up around the bunny, but it is along the bottom. So it's kind of a nice little hint. And I feel like it's tying things together in a really subtle way. Not that they have to be tied together, but I just enjoy thinking that at some level, this continuous scroll has some things that are continuous in it. So that's a nice touch. I'm coming in with this light blue color, which is the same color that I've used here behind the bunny. And there's also some here behind this swan. And there's a little bit here. So I've used it throughout the piece, and I'm going to come in behind my heron and add some more slow stitching lines. I'm going to go in between these green stitches and work across, filling in the gaps. So I've taken this turquoise blue color and I'm extending the stitches that were here. I'm not going to put them in the other direction, whereas here I went up and down with them in both directions, and there's a little bit of that here, but I'm just going to do it in this one direction. I think it's a nice color to add, and it also continues those slow stitching lines that I had done previously. Then I'm going to come back in and maybe add one more layer of stitch to this background. So I added white to the background as well, just to echo what I'd done over here. And I'm looking at this scene, and I think that this little piece of this orangey yellow silk, which also I have a piece of over here, I think I want to add another piece of it down in this area. So I've snipped a little piece here that I think is about the right size. And I want to stitch that down. So because I have a lot of this green in here on this side, I'm going to come in with the green and stitch it down. And I have stitches underneath that I'm going to cover up by putting this piece down, and that's fine. That's part of the process. It's part of the additive process of this. So I'm going to stitch this in place by just coming up, holding it with my thumb, and stitching it down. So that's looking good there to me. We're going to stitch around the edges and add some stitches similar to these to sort of incorporate it. And it'll look like it's always been there. So that's in place, and I'm glad that I've added that. And now I'm going to move on to this area with the blanket stitching, and I'm going to be adding some color into it. Now here's what I did in this area where I'd added it before. I came back in with some colors that I wanted to integrate into this area because it was fairly plain green without anything else. And so I looked at the pinks and the yellows and the blues, and I thought I would bring them in. So really these are just stitches close together. It's often called satin stitch, and really they're just straight stitches that you put very close together. And what I'm doing here is really just coloring in some of the boxes. And it's an intuitive process where I pick a color and I just move around. You can see on the back where I've hopped from place to place. So it's really just following in the moment where you think another area of color would be nice to fill in. So that's what I want to do here. And I'm going to start with yellow because yellow is here, and there's also yellow over here. And so I thought it would be a good color to bring in. And then once the yellow's there, I will get an idea for the next color. It could be a gray from this bird. It could be some brown tones from the chicken. Could be some orange tones. Really, it will be something that I think of in the moment, and I'm just going to keep adding and adding. And that's how you get this nice effect here that really serves to tie this into the next area and really unifies the overall look. So I've started in with the yellow, and I'll show you how I do this. So I just completed this one, and I'm going to hop down to say right here. I could also go right here, just kind of going by eye, and yeah, you can't really go wrong. Just whatever you think. So I come up in the corner, and I go down and make a line, and then I just keep making another stitch beside that one until the entire box is filled in. So straight stitches as close together as I can place them. And then once the box is filled in, if there's a spot that looks like there's a little gap that maybe it could do with another stitch, then I can just go back and put another stitch there. So there's my yellow. And I think now I'm going to just keep going. I'm thinking about one of these hen colors, one of these browns I'm gonna grab, probably the lighter one, and I'm gonna keep going with this. So I have yellow, I have the lighter golden brown from here, and I have this blue, which is really all over the piece, including in here and in the background here. So that's a really good start. I may add more later, I may leave it, but now I'm going to move on to something else. I find that it's good to concentrate on one area and then hop to a new one, and it keeps the flow of creativity going. So I'm going to tackle this very last bird, and I think that I want to make this bird a robin. And I have another idea I want to share that may be helpful in stitching your birds and your animals. I'm going to take jelly roll pens. Now, some of the jelly roll pens are permanent, and these are the kinds that I have. When you buy a package, I think this one came in a package of maybe 8 or something. It did say on the package that they were permanent. So you can take jelly roll pens. So I've got here, this color is kind of more of a pinky color than a brown, and a brown. And I'm going to color in this bird. Well, the reason I recommend a jelly roll pen instead of a felt pen is because felt pens will wick and soak in and go past the boundaries that you want. Or there's always the chance that they can anyway, so I don't like to use any kind of a marker on fabric. Even though it is a felt pen, some people have success with these Pigma Micron pens, and they're permanent as well. So I would experiment on a piece of fabric before you used these. But I like to use the jelly rolls, and they are a good way to sort of fill in an area. And what will happen is when you stitch, instead of being green, there'll be the color behind it, and it just makes your stitching go a little bit easier, and you don't have to do quite as much filling in if you don't want to cover up the green like I've done here. And even with all this heavy stitching I'm done, if you really look, you can see some green showing through. So in case you don't want that, a jelly roll is a good way to go. So I also have a black one of these. So I'm going to start, I think, with this color and see how it shows up. And start doing the breast of the robin. Yeah, this color is looking good, so I'll stick with this one. So I'm going to give this a chance to dry. And it's just going to help when I stitch. There's going to be a background color. I'm pressing lightly. I don't want to pull on the fabric. And then I can come in with my black and kind of get the shape of the wing here and fill it in. The black's not giving as good coverage as the brown, but that's okay because I am going to be stitching over this. I'm going to make a little eye, and then there's usually some white around the eye, so I'm not going to put my pin there, and I'm also going to leave some space for sort of yellowish beak. I'm trying to sort of dot instead of pull, so I don't stretch the fabric too much. So that's looking good to me. That's about as much as I feel I need to fill it in, because my stitching is going to cover it, but that's going to give me a little bit of more leeway than leaving it blank. So if you're doing an animal or a bird where that's possible and you have the jelly roll pens, that's a way to go. That would have worked here with the bunny. If I could have used this lighter color and filled in the bunny and come over top if I wanted to add a little bit of dimension there. So it's always an option. You can do it with white if I had wanted to do it here, but the white tends to soak in quite a bit more and become invisible. It doesn't stay on the surface as much as these colored ones. So my idea with this last section is to add, I'm thinking of like branches and trees and grass as well. So I have this piece of fabric that I just had this strip that I thought would fit nicely here. And if I fold it over, let's see, if I fold it in half, you don't see quite as much. So I thought maybe I could bring this one down a little further maybe than I have here. So I will stitch that on, and then I can start deciding how to build out this area. So I've stitched this on. There was a little piece that was hanging off the end, so I snipped it and put it down here under the bird. And I'm going to use this color for the chest of the bird, and it's a little more orange than what's here. And this is the color that I've used already in the piece. So that's why I want to use it again. I've got some of it here and in some other spots. And then I'm going to use a very dark gray and some black for the bird. And I'm going to stitch the bird in a similar way that I stitched this bird, although this time I may be able to just use 2 strands and not have to come in with the 1 strand because I have this jelly ink underneath it. So I've stitched this color, and having that brown underneath has really helped fill in any little gaps in the stitching. So I'm going to do the same thing with the rest of the bird. I'm going to be able to give this bird a little yellow beak without much of a problem because this is a very pale green. It's not going to be a problem. But for example, if I want the white around the eye, then I'll have to stitch some white, and there may be a bit of green showing through, but the main body of the bird, it's really nice to be able to do this. Especially if you're working on a very light colored fabric, it's nice to be able to fill in so that lightness doesn't show through. So there's the bird completed with 2 strands, except for the beak and a couple of little stitches of white around the eye, and here is 1 strand. The rest of it was 2 strands, and I think having that color underneath really benefited the stitching. So that's something to try. So in building this out, I've pulled some more fabric, and I'm going to cut around one piece so that I could place the designs exactly where I want them to be. So I'm thinking about something like this. This is sort of an abstract pointing towards the trees. So I'm going to stitch these pieces down and then see if I want to add more with either stitch or more fabric. So I tacked these down. I decided to put this piece, instead of putting it down here, I flipped it and put it up at the side. And then I've added running stitches going horizontally in the background. So that's unified the collage. Haven't added as many in the top here, but that's an option that I can still do. But my main goal was to kind of unify these pieces. So there's a little more dense stitching here than there is at the top and the bottom. And what I want to do with this bird is I want to put this bird on some branches, thinking that this bird's sitting in a tree. So I'm going to come in, I think, with my marking pen, and I'm going to mark some lines. Because it's heat erasable, it's going to be very forgiving. If there's a line I don't like, I don't have to stitch it, and I can erase it later. So something like this is fairly simple. And then after I've stitched this branch that the robin will be on, I can decide I can add more behind or I can add more down here, but this is a good place to start, and then I can go from there. And as you've seen with each of these little individual scenes, they just build on each other and it just gets more depth and more interest as you go. So that's the same process I'm doing here. I'm just going to add and add and add. So I've added a few branches. I extended the lines of this piece of fabric as well, to give the impression of more trees. And this piece of fabric, I extended that design up to make it continue up here. And now I've got 2 strands of the light and dark green, like I did here, and I'm just continuing that across. I've added these little pieces of silk, which are here and in other places in the piece, to bring in a bit of color. And this whole area I'm going to add these stitches to, and that's going to blend it in with this. And then over here where I've added a little piece of silk, and I put it over top of the area where I'd done the blanket stitch, and I think that that connects these areas. And I'm also going to take the same 2-tone green that I'm working with, and I'm going to extend this grassy impression here. I'm going to extend it down here and across into where I already have it, where this hen is. So that's going to really integrate this area of the blanket stitch, and it's going to kind of join this whole strip just through these 2 colors and some straight stitches everywhere. So I've taken those green stitches all through here under the bird, along the bottom, into where the hen is, and some of it in through this blanket stitching, which has further pushed it back a bit and integrated it. So I'm really happy with the way that that's looking. I also took a piece of green and I stitched it around the side to the back before I added these stitches. So this is looking quite good to me. I added a little bit more branch to the tree. So now it's really just some finishing touches. And then I'm going to be ready to add the backing and finish this piece off. Just a few small things to do. I'm going to add some more stitching going vertically in the background so it lines up more with what's here. I want to add something in this area, and I have a couple of ideas. So join me next time when I put the finishing touches on this stitch scene and then move to the final stages of adding a backing, embellishing the back, and deciding how this is going to be stored and displayed, and the options for doing that. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, happy stitching.